Welcome back to Face the Nation. We continue with our conversation with David Rubenstein. You've had success in the public sector, private sector, philanthropy. Let's say you were thrust into the job as the president. What do you think the hardest part of the job would be?
I would want to surround myself with people who I thought had experience, who had the right motivations, were coming into public service because they wanted to help the country and not for any other purpose. I'd want to make sure I recognize that members of Congress are an equal branch of government and want to work cooperatively with them. And also want to recognize that the judiciary is also an equal branch of government, and what it says also is very important in terms of how the government is to be governed. But also, the most important thing is persuading people to do things that you think are the right things to do. And you have persuade people by being honest with them, being forthright with them, bringing them along in a way that I think makes people feel they are getting something from the negotiation. A good negotiation is one where both sides feel they're getting something. They're not completely happy with it, but they're getting something out of it.
How do you think Donald Trump has done on that front?
Well, I think it's very difficult to judge a president this early, to be honest. I think most historians would say, give me 40 years after the presidency to evaluate whether the person's done a good or bad job.
Given what you know about the presidency, when you hear it talked about in presidential campaigns, is there a part of that conversation that you say, you know, this is nice, but it's really not what the job is?
Well, when you're running for president of the United States, your job is to get elected to some extent and do so in a reasonably honorable way. You can't say things that are ridiculous, I think, but you should do so in a reasonably honorable way. But you have to recognize that what people say in a campaign rarely can get implemented so easily. So if you say, I want to have a certain type of tax, I want to change the law this way, it's not that easy to do. You have to deal with Congress. And so I think it would be a good idea if people were to propose things that are realistically possible and not to ignore the impossibility of doing something great, but sometimes you have to have bold ideas, and bold ideas are good, but sometimes some things are just not going to happen, and you can get people excited about the prospect of it, and you're really going to disappoint people.
If you could give the American story to every presidential candidate, what lesson would you hope they'd draw from it?
I would say to all presidential candidates, learn more about American history, learn about the things we've done right and wrong in the past. Do not think you have the sole knowledge of what the right thing to do is, and bring other people into the equation. Make sure you bring into your proposals about what you want to have done and into your administration, if you're elected, people that have a sense of history. Very often, many of our presidents have met with historians because they want to learn what previous presidents did. And I think that's a good thing, and I think learning what our previous presidents did, the good and bad, is a good way to learn how to be a good president.
Rubenstein's book was published by Simon & Schuster, a division of the CBS Corporation. The full interview is on our website, facethenation.com. We'll be back in a moment with our book panel. We turn now to a conversation with four authors whose books focus on presidents and patriotism and politics. Ruth Marcus is the author of a new book that looks at one party's mission to control the Supreme Court. Supreme Ambition, Brett Kavanaugh and the Conservative Takeover. Michael Duffy is the co-author of The President's Club, Inside the World's Most Exclusive Fraternity. Susan Page is the author of The Matriarch, Barbara Bush and the Making of an American Dynasty, and the upcoming Madam Speaker, Nancy Pelosi and the Ark of Power. Our final panelist, John Meacham, joins us from Nashville. His latest book is The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. It examines national divisions at critical times in our history. John, I am going to start with you. You wrote recently that this impeachment question tells us something larger. It's not just about a president. It tells us something about the country. So what are the stakes right now?
Folded at moments of enormous existential crisis over the direction of the country. Andrew Johnson and the verdict of the Civil War. Were we really going to act on the implications of the victory, of the Union victory at Appomattox? President Nixon was coming with Vietnam and the questions about the nature of the country. In many ways, in fact, I think we can think of the modern founding of the country as 1964-65 with the Civil Rights Act. We've only governed this particular polity for 55 years or so, and Vietnam and that era was a period of enormous tension And the Clinton era was, in a way, a precursor to this one, where we were returning to an 18th and 19th century system of partisan media. It was, to some extent, a battle over generational power. And now we face this wildly unconventional president who is actively and overtly putting all the norms that so many of us were accustomed to on trial. And so we have these forces in American life that are perennial: xenophobia, extremism, racism, nativism, isolationism. They ebb and they flow in American life. They always have. And right now they're flowing. The task of the country is to get them to ebb.
And Ruth, what John describes and sets the table for there nicely, it feels like we had a bit of a preview of what we're going to see with impeachment here, which is what you write about with the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation. Do you see those parallels?
Indeed, and I think they're disturbing parallels that mainly involve the reflexive and automatic and unrelenting partisanship of our time that John and others have referred to. Republicans complain that we can't take impeachment now seriously because Democrats were talking about impeaching the president even before he was sworn in. Correct. Republicans claim that we couldn't take the allegations against Justice Kavanaugh seriously because Democrats were out to get him from the start and these only arose at the last minute. Correct. But in both situations, the question is, were there serious allegations, are there serious allegations in the case of impeachment against the target of Democratic ire? And are we capable of taking those allegations seriously? Or do we so automatically go to our corners that we're not capable of rising above partisanship? I think that's a really open and serious question.
One, Michael, you wrote about this extraordinary thing. Bill Clinton, when he was going through this, called Richard Nixon. So the idea that two presidents across that period of time would have a conversation, I mean, you can't imagine Donald Trump calling Bill Clinton that.
No, I think Clinton admired Nixon's just resilience, the fact that he gutted it out. And the famous quote from the Clinton impeachment experience was, "We'll just have to win this," when it was clear that he had done whatever he had done. And we're just going to have to win this. And I think he looked to Nixon and Nixon's experience as a model, because Nixon fought right up until the time the smoking gun came out, and then, of course, his party abandoned him. Both men were survivors, and both men fought like the Dickens to hold on to power until they, in Nixon's case, couldn't. One other thing about that relationship, it would fall to Clinton, of course, to eulogize Nixon in 1994 when he finally died, 20 years after he left office. And Clinton's famous remark at the eulogy was, "May the days of judging Richard Nixon on just one part of his life be brought to a close," which of course was a benediction and a prayer for him and all presidents.
Right.
Rather convenient.
Yes, he was making an appeal for the long, sweeping view.
And for all the presidents who would afterwards.
Susan, I want to ask you about another part of this drama which has really struck me is during the testimony in front of the House Intelligence Committee, a lot of the witnesses did not just start with the facts of the case. They, in writing, we talk about going up to 30,000 feet. They talked about the role America plays in the world. They talked about their immigrant backgrounds. What did you make of that?
This was the impeachment hearings were in many ways kind of a dispiriting episode both because of the allegations being made and because of the partisan response to them. But I thought it was inspirational to hear from these witnesses, career public servants, who started by talking about their immigrant backgrounds. Two of them immigrants, one of them the child of immigrants, families that had fled Nazi Germany, had fled the Soviet Union, had come here for greater economic opportunity, loss of a class structure. And they talked about how grateful they were to America for taking them in, giving them this opportunity. And that was one reason they had chosen the path of service that they had. I thought that was the best moment. It was a reminder of what Americans want to protect about our country that seems often just so battered in these times.
Right. In this room is not just the behavior of a president, but questions of bedrock, basic American values that everybody is also fighting over. John, I want to get your thoughts about the task before the House Judiciary Committee this week, which is to start looking at the Constitution and what guidance it gives for this inquiry. What wisdom do you think the document or that summer in Philadelphia should give us in terms of thinking about this?
The impeachment clause was added in part because George Mason of Virginia argued that shall any man be above justice? That was the central question. And the question that the framers tried to argue and answer was that there had to be a check and a balance on the executive. The entire insight, remember, of the guiding insight of the Constitution was that we would screw everything up. And we've done everything we can since then to prove them right. It's a fundamentally human document, informed by a kind of Calvinistic insight that we would be driven by appetite, we'd be driven by ambition, we were shaped by shortcoming and sin, and therefore sovereignty had to be divided. All power could not be given to any one element in the Republican, lowercase r, contract. And so impeachment was a hugely important element there. The article is very short. It's about treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. The latter phrase comes from the English common law. And as Gerald Ford famously remarked, a high crime and misdemeanor is whatever a majority of the House of Representatives says it is at any given moment. And this generation, this group of members of Congress, now has to face a genuine test. Are they going to follow the facts, or are they going to use Ruth's phrase, are they going to reflexively be partisan and interpret reality not as they see it, but as they wish to see it?
Ruth, one of the things is that we still don't know what the actual position is, because you can say, well, there were these acts, but they don't raise to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors. But the president is saying these acts weren't even bad in the first place. You've been studying the idea of originalism, the original public meaning of the Constitution. Does that give us any guidance here for how to interpret this moment?
The guidance is very Fordian in the sense that it is really a political question that is up to the political branch. But yes, the framers were entirely worried about precisely the kind of event that we're talking about here: foreign influence, the misuse of presidential power for public gain and political advantage rather than for the public good. If you were going to, the question that I would have for Republicans is, if this does not rise to the level of a high crime or misdemeanor or look a lot like the framers' conception of bribery, what does? And the thing that I would say that gives me some concern here, I think the facts are so serious that the House was really constitutionally obliged to launch an impeachment inquiry, but we have now gone through 3 of these in our lifetimes. And impeachment was supposed to be, and it should be, a break in case of emergency inquiry. And now I worry that we will unleash it as just another political tool.
And Michael, it's happening in an election year, which we haven't seen before.
No, it's always in the past happened in a second term, at least in our lifetime. So this allows the Republicans to argue, somewhat justifiably, that, look, we're going to have an election in a year, just wait. You can make up your decision and let the people decide. And they're deploying that almost daily or hourly. That raises another thing about John's test of Madisonian democracy. We're all hyperdosing on this stuff. And depending on whether you're like us and you have to drink it every day, or you're just following along informally, it can seem at times that this is the worst that the country has ever faced. But I suspect that between a whole number of times, 1777, 1863, 1932, there have been other difficult times. What's different now is that how we're experiencing it. That we're self-arming for division, because so much of the information we get is coming to us through our devices, and those devices are weaponized to sort of alienate and divide us. And that is a difference in certainly between this and the last impeachment and all the ones that have come before. And I think this is the test of Madisonian democracy, that we're meant to have our better angels work at all levels here. But at every turn, we are being fed information that divides us rather than brings us together, and that is a real test of whether we can survive.
And we're self-satisfying ourselves by continuing to drink that ourselves. Susan, Michael just described the state of affairs. Nancy Pelosi didn't want to go down this impeachment road, felt like she had to. What is the state of the Nancy Pelosi view of the world as she tries to hold on to power at a time that we're in this volatile moment?
Well, this is very much what Nancy Pelosi predicted would happen when she was holding off some Democratic instincts to impeach the president months ago, years ago, since soon after his election, which is that it would be divisive for the country and you shouldn't go forward unless you could get bipartisan support. But then you had the Ukraine phone call come out, and I think at that point she decided that you had no option. As Ruth was saying, you had, if not this, what would be impeachable, had to go forward. She has tried to keep the focus narrowly on the Ukraine matter, to keep the timetable going incredibly fast. The speed of this impeachment inquiry is really quite breathtaking, with the idea that we're going to see articles of impeachment perhaps this week. We're going to see a vote of the House before the end of the year, and then it goes to the Senate. And I think the instinct in the Senate is also, let's do this and get it off our plate.
Michael, before we go, I want to ask you about the 2020 election. I don't know whether when I worked with you or somebody when we were back at Time Magazine said every election is about one question. Maybe they didn't say that, but I'm going to. What is the question of this election?
Well, all elections are about, hope or fear, and whether you or about change, and whether you hope for change or fear it. I think at the moment this is unquestionably is whatever they think about impeachment in a year, given what Amy said in the previous segment. This will be a referendum on Donald Trump, no question. And impeachment may play into that. Both sides think it's going to help them. That's what's so interesting. The Democrats think they have to push this through and have this test and show that they have done it in order to help build their support in their base. Republicans, I think, increasingly think this will build our base as well and turn out the people who believe Donald Trump.
I disagree. I think both parties think they hope it helps them. Mm-hmm. I think both parties fear it's going to hurt them. And I think at this point it is impossible to figure out exactly what the politics of this issue is going to be.
Let me ask the final question to you, John Meacham. David Rubenstein suggested it takes 40 years before you can weigh in on a president. What's your view on that? And we should let people know that you weighed in on George Herbert Walker Bush before that timeline.
25. Michael Beschloss, our friend, says 25 years, and so I'm a Beschlossian on this important question. And I think that's about right. 40 years is biblical, and so therefore we should be for it. But I think 25 at least worked for me. And I would say, if I may, President Bush died a year ago yesterday. And when you think about however imperfect a man he was in life and politics, we all have our problems. But he really embodied a kind of public service that seems incredibly remote now. It's almost as though we're talking about Agincourt when we think about a man who, a Republican president who signed the Americans with Disabilities Act and managed the fall of the Berlin Wall with such grace and restraint. And I think that when we think about that everything is cataclysmic and we're always at the edge of a cliff, 25 years ago, we had a president that's almost unimaginable now until, as he would put it, we imagine it again. And so, the first election we had in this country that was about the soul of America was 1800, when Thomas Jefferson ran saying we needed a revolution to get back to 1776. So if they were talking that way then, it's not surprising that we're talking this way now.
All right, John Meacham, thank you so much. And thanks all of you for being with us. We are going to ask Ruth to stick around for a few more minutes, and so you do that too. We'll be right back. We're back with Ruth Marcus to talk more about her book, Supreme Ambition, Brett Kavanaugh and the Conservative Takeover.
Hi.
Welcome back, Ruth.
Thank you.
So, some people may think of this as what they saw through their television screen, which were faces in a room with a bunch of senators. But you sketch a story of titanic forces in America. Bring some of those forces into the story to remind people of really all that's going on in this drama.
Sure. Well, as you say, this is not, everybody was transfixed for a few weeks in the fall of 2018. But this is a story that stretches back decades, literally. This is a 30 years war on behalf of Republicans and conservatives to finally cement a conservative majority on the Supreme Court. And that is the opportunity that they had with the resignation of Justice Anthony Kennedy and with the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh. And as the problems arose with the Kavanaugh nomination, Republicans rallied around him in part because of some of the forces of partisanship that we've been talking about previously, but also because this was their moment to finally achieve this goal of 30 years, and Brett Kavanaugh was too big to fail. They were not going to allow him to do that. And so what I tell in the book, Supreme Ambition, is the story of how everyone from the White House counsel who refused to take a phone call from the president, who was trying desperately to reach him. Don McGahn was worried that the president was going to tell him to yank the Kavanaugh nomination. He didn't want to hear from him. He didn't want to take a call from the most powerful man in America. He told his deputy, I don't talk to quitters. It's a story of how the FBI and senators, Republican and Democrat, refused to pursue leads that might have jeopardized the Kavanaugh nomination. And it's the story of what the implications are of this nomination for our country, because long after we're done with impeachment and long after the 2020 election, Donald Trump's legacy is going to be the judges that he put on the federal courts and on the Supreme Court, and it is going to be the triumph of conservatives, which explains why they have stuck with him for so long.
And that's a 30 to 40 year, depending on the lifespan of the judges, 30 to 4 year impact on American life, not 4 or 8 years of a presidency.
No, it is a long time, and Donald Trump has been going around and boasting about how his judges are younger than Obama judges. They're going to be around for a while.
Let's talk about Don McGahn, the White House counsel. Really interesting. You just talked about an act of insubordination. There's been a lot of talk about when a staffer can and can't be insubordinate. He is perhaps, and you tell me what you think, the most powerful and beneficial advisor the president has. Wouldn't maybe have gotten elected without him.
So a couple things. Right here in this very building at the Jones Day law firm, Don McGahn helped to orchestrate the thing that probably, among everything else, helped Donald Trump get elected president, which was creating a list of Supreme Court nominees. Not a surprise to have a short list, hugely Trumpian and never done before to have a list that was made public. Guess who was not on that list? Brett Kavanaugh.
Made public during the campaign.
Made public during the campaign, and Brett Kavanaugh managed, with the help of his friends, including Justice Kennedy, to make his way onto that list, and with the help of Don McGahn, who is a fascinating figure, the most consequential White House counsel in history. Both Donald Trump's greatest help in terms of this legacy, helping to build the legacy along with the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, that will outlast this president and that he will be proudest of in the long run, but also in the Mueller investigation, and we still see conversations about whether we'll ever get his testimony on that, the president's greatest problem, because he testified and basically created the elements of the obstruction case against the president with Mueller.
15 seconds. The reason the list was so important is it showed conservatives that Donald Trump was
somebody who they could trust and to be taken seriously, and that he would achieve what Republican presidents before him had not managed to achieve and had squandered.
Mitch McConnell thinks that's why he's president. Ruth Marcus,
Indeed.
thanks so much. It's a great book. Supreme Ambition is out Tuesday. It was published by Simon & Schuster, a division of the CBS Corporation. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching, and thank you to the Jones Day Law Firm for the facilities here on Capitol Hill. Margaret will be back next week for Face the Nation. I'm John Dickerson.